She thought no one was watching. A tired black nanny, worn from years of struggle, quietly stayed by an elderly woman's side, protecting her when even her own son wasn't there. The woman's mind was fading from Alzheimer's, but in those fragile moments, the nanny's care spoke louder than words. What seemed like a simple act of kindness would uncover painful truths about race, privilege, and loyalty. When the millionaire's son walked in, he never expected to find her, and what he discovered changed everything. For most of his life, Daniel Rivers had known the comfort of wealth, a millionaire by inheritance. He grew up believing that money could solve almost anything. His mother, Eleanor, had once been a strong, dignified woman who commanded respect in every room she entered. But Alzheimer's was cruel. It stripped her of memory, clarity, and independence. What remained was a fragile shadow of the woman she used to be. To ensure she was never alone, the family had hired a nanny. Her name was Grace, a black woman who had spent decades working quietly in homes that were not her own. She was steady, invisible to some, but present in every way that mattered. Day after day, Grace cared for Eleanor with a patience few could sustain, her life revolving around the needs of someone else's family. For Daniel, this arrangement was practical. He visited when he could, sent checks when needed, and assumed everything was handled. But what he didn't know was that Grace's role had grown far beyond duty. While Eleanor drifted deeper into confusion, Grace had become her anchor, shielding her from dangers big and small. Still, beneath this quiet routine, unspoken tensions lingered. Wealth and race drew invisible lines in the house. Grace knew her place was seen as help, even though her devotion often surpassed that of the family themselves. And Daniel, distracted by his own world, never considered what sacrifices Grace was making in silence, until the day he walked through the door and saw something he never expected. A moment so raw, so unsettling, it forced him to question not just Grace's role, but the very truths he had chosen to ignore his entire life. Grace's days were long, filled with the quiet rhythms of care. She guided Eleanor through forgotten routines, feeding her, brushing her hair, keeping her calm when confusion turned to fear. To outsiders, it seemed like a job, but to Grace, it was survival. Because every move she made, every decision, was under the unspoken weight of being a black woman in a white family's world. Though Eleanor often mistook faces and names, she never forgot the comfort Grace brought. When her son, Daniel, was absent for weeks at a time, it was Grace who stayed through the storms. Through nights when Eleanor cried for people long gone, through mornings when she didn't recognize her own reflection. Grace had seen this disease before. She knew it wasn't just memory that faded. It was dignity, and she fought every day to give Eleanor some piece of it back. But not everyone saw it that way. Neighbors whispered, questioning why a black woman spent so much time in the Rivers' home. Some assumed she was taking advantage. Others made cruel jokes about hired help knowing her place. Grace kept her head down, but the sting never fully left. She had heard it all before, at bus stops, in grocery aisles, in the very houses she worked in. Her devotion was always suspect, her humanity always questioned. And Daniel, he was comfortable in his distance. Whenever he visited, he would nod politely, thank Grace mechanically, and retreat to his own world. He never asked about the late nights Grace stayed after hours. He didn't notice the bruises on her arms from catching Eleanor when she fell. He didn't see the exhaustion in her eyes from carrying a burden no paycheck could cover. But the tension grew the night Eleanor wandered. It was nearly midnight when Grace realized the bed was empty. Panic seized her chest. She rushed through the hallways, calling Eleanor's name, heart hammering as the front door creaked open. Outside, the air was cold, and Eleanor stood barefoot on the porch, confused and shivering. A passing neighbor stopped, their face twisting into suspicion at the sight of a black woman clutching an elderly white woman in the dark. The man didn't ask if Eleanor was safe. He didn't ask what had happened. Instead, he pulled out his phone. "Do you belong here?" he demanded, his tone sharp, dripping with accusation. Grace tried to explain, her voice breaking, but the man had already dialed 911. In those moments, Grace's years of loyalty meant nothing. To him, she wasn't a caregiver. She wasn't someone protecting a vulnerable woman. She was a threat, A black body in the wrong place. The police arrived within minutes. Flashing lights cut through the night as Eleanor clung to Grace, trembling, still unaware of what was happening. Officers stepped out, hands resting near their holsters. They didn't see Eleanor's confusion or Grace's desperation. What they saw was a black woman standing on the porch of a wealthy home, holding someone who didn't look like family. "Ma'am!" "Step away from her," one officer ordered. Grace froze, torn between obeying and staying close to Eleanor, who was terrified. Each second felt like a lifetime. She raised her hand slowly, tears burning her eyes, while Eleanor whimpered, asking for a friend without realizing who she meant. The officers questioned her harshly, their voices firm, their suspicion clear. Grace explained again and again that she worked for the family, that Eleanor was sick, that she was only protecting her. But the words hung useless in the air, drowned by the weight of prejudice. And then, headlights cut into the driveway. Daniel had arrived. He stepped out, confused by the flashing lights and the scene unfolding in front of his home. For the first time, he saw Grace not as an employee, but as a woman surrounded, accused, and cornered by a system too quick to condemn. He saw his mother clutching Grace's arm with a trust deeper than memory, a trust that defied even disease. In that moment, Daniel's world began to fracture. Because the truth was undeniable, Grace had done more for his mother than he ever had. And yet, she was the one standing under suspicion, her years of sacrifice erased in seconds. But the night was far from over. The police weren't satisfied, and the neighbor's story painted Grace as someone she was not. Daniel now stood at a crossroads, between silence, which had always been easier, or action, which would mean confronting not just strangers, but the very privilege that had kept him blind. And what he chose to do next would define everything that followed. The blue and red lights painted the house in violent colors, washing over Grace as if she were a criminal caught in the act. She stood frozen on the porch, her hands trembling in the air, her body framed by suspicion. Eleanor clung to her arm, frail and trembling, whispering words no one could understand. But the officers didn't see the bond. They saw a black woman in the wrong place, at the wrong time. One officer stepped closer, his hand grazing the edge of his holster. His voice was sharp, commanding, "Step back now." Grace's chest tightened. She had heard those words before, in stories that ended in silence, in headlines that screamed of lives cut short. One wrong move, and she could become another name in the endless tally of injustice. Daniel watched from the driveway, his world collapsing. Just hours ago, he had been lost in the comfort of his wealth, disconnected from the daily struggles Grace endured. Now he saw her cornered, guilty in their eyes before a word was spoken. For the first time, privilege didn't shield him from the reality unfolding in front of him. His mother wasn't safe because of his money. She was safe because of Grace. And yet, Grace was the one treated as a threat. "Tell them." Grace cried out, her voice breaking under the weight of fear and exhaustion. Her eyes locked on Daniel, desperate, pleading, not just for him to speak, but for him to finally see. Eleanor's frail body leaned into her, clinging tighter, as if her fading memory still knew who truly loved her. The officers glanced at Daniel, waiting for confirmation, for any sign that Grace belonged. But his silence stretched too long. Doubt flickered in their eyes. Grace's heart pounded like a drum in her chest. She thought of the years she had given, sleepless nights, meals skipped, dignity swallowed. And now, it could all end here, erased by suspicion and skin color. The air thickened, heavy with a terrible possibility. One wrong breath, one twitch of her arm, and everything could spiral. Daniel's hands shook as he stepped forward, his voice finally breaking the tension. "She's not a stranger. She's the reason my mother is alive. She's the one protecting her when I wasn't here." His words rang out, cutting through the night, but the damage was already done. Because the truth wasn't enough. The officers still questioned, still lingered, still carried the weight of a system built to doubt her. Grace stood there, humiliated, her years of loyalty stripped to nothing in front of flashing lights and accusing eyes. And Daniel realized that no matter what he said, no matter how much he praised her, it would never undo what she had just endured. For Grace, this wasn't just another night. This was the moment her entire life condensed into one terrifying truth. No amount of devotion, sacrifice, or love could protect her from the shadow of prejudice. She could give everything and still be seen as nothing. Eleanor, in her haze, reached for Grace's hand and whispered softly, "Don't leave me." Her voice cracked with desperation, a fragile plea that pierced through the chaos. And in that moment, Daniel finally saw it. Not just the injustice of this night, but the deep, unshakable bond between his mother and the woman society dismissed as help. The tension hung unbearable as the officers hesitated. Grace stood shaking. Eleanor clung tighter, and Daniel's heart pounded with guilt and awakening. This was the breaking point. The night everything he thought he knew about privilege, loyalty, and justice shattered before his eyes. And as the lights flickered across Grace's tear-streaked face, the question lingered in the air. Would this be the moment that changed Daniel forever, or would it simply become another story erased by silence? The flashing lights eventually dimmed, the officers retreating after Daniel's repeated insistence that Grace belonged in the home. On the surface, the night ended without arrests, without violence. But the damage was already etched deep into Grace's spirit. She stood in the quiet that followed, her heart still racing, her hands trembling as she held on to Eleanor, more to steady herself in the frail woman who clung to her. For Daniel, the silence was deafening. He had watched his mother's caregiver, her lifeline, treated as if she were disposable, as if years of sacrifice and loyalty carried no weight against the color of her skin. That image would haunt him long after the police cars left. He couldn't escape the truth. While he had lived comfortably in privilege, Grace had carried a burden he had never bothered to see. In the days that followed, Daniel tried to make amends. He apologized, offered more money, promised to do better. But Grace knew what he could not undo. No paycheck, no apology could erase the humiliation of being accused in the very house where she had poured her heart into caring for another human being. No words to erase the fear that night. The memory of flashing lights and suspicious eyes that nearly turned her devotion into a crime. And yet, Grace returned to her work. Not because she owed the Rivers family anything, but because Eleanor needed her. Her compassion ran deeper than bitterness. Still, something inside her had shifted. She had always known the risks of moving to the world in her skin. But now, she carried the fresh weight of how easily years of loyalty could vanish beneath suspicion. For Daniel, the lesson struck like a wound. He began to see the world through Grace's eyes. The sidelong glances in grocery stores, the way neighbors questioned her presence, the silence he himself had kept for too long. That night forced him to confront the truth that racism was not distant, not abstract. It was on his doorstep, wrapped in flashing lights and whispered suspicions. This wasn't just about Grace. It wasn't just about Eleanor. It was about every person whose humanity is questioned because of their skin. Every caregiver, every worker, every neighbor who lives under the shadow of doubt that privilege never feels. It was about the way a system can strip dignity in seconds and how silence is silence, helps it thrive. Grace's story is not unique. It is lived daily in countless ways. Small humiliations, dangerous encounters, lives reduced to suspicion. And while Daniel could walk away shaken but safe, Grace could not. This was her reality. This was the world she had to navigate. Day after day, the night may have ended, but the question remained. How many more times must someone like Grace stand trembling under flashing lights before the world finally believes her humanity? How many more stories must unfold before silence is broken, before privilege becomes action, before justice becomes more than a promise? This is not just Grace's story. It is the story of a nation, the story of neighbors who look but do not see, the story of wealth that blinds, of systems that crush, of voices that are silenced. But it is also a story of resilience, of a woman who, despite the fear and humiliation, chose to keep protecting, keep caring, keep holding on to her humanity when the world tried to strip it away. So the next time we see the lights flash, the suspicion rise, the dignity questioned, we must ask ourselves, will we stand silent or will we finally stand with Grace?